Chapter 4. The king and queen of Error during my youth were wise beyond their years, and that wisdom lasted until their deaths. I remember them fondly even now, after all that has happened. They had an otherworldly love for one another, and that overwhelming love spilled over as a merciful grace to the whole kingdom. Despite this, many used it against them, exploiting their compassion through further daring crimes and accepting the lightest of sentences with a snake's smile. And yet, the king and queen continued to personally aid those in need, gave counsel to the wretched, and served with such miraculous kindness that if not for their son Genra, they would have been remembered for eternity. Verse 5 of the Confessional Monolith. Cullen's heart was still beating to the cold rhythm of realization, and new ideas were swirling about in his mind regarding the potential strategies against the Genranites as he walked the south streets of the village. It had only been 15 minutes since he had traded with those greedy snakes, and already several scenarios of potential futures had run through his mind. Would a glorious rebellion blossom, led by Cullen and his father against their greedy overlords? Or perhaps the influence of the Genranites had already corrupted everyone else in the valley, and the two of them would become outlaws, hiding in the mountains with Snuffler, awaiting a daring chance to strike back. By the time the shingled dome of Hina's brewery was in sight, his thoughts had settled into more realistic and plausible scenarios of negotiation, with a smattering of secretive strikes to dull the Genry's pride. For now, he'd use this time at the brewery to get a bit more information from Yeeg and the others about how the village perceived their extortioners. This meeting at the bar was a typical celebration every month upon Cullen's return from the mountains, but now its secondary purpose held far more importance than ever before. Snuffler's excited cry upon seeing the large circular shape of the cozy brewery jolted Cullen out of his deep thought, and she bolted towards the former storehouse with a speed that caused many of the villagers on the street to lunge out of the way, staring at the mountain boar with amazement, which turned to an amused recognition after a few seconds. "So much for a quiet entrance, girl," Cullen muttered. He waved to the others on the street in apology, and hurried after her. "Calm down, Snuff!" Annoyance with himself wormed in his chest as he broke into a sprint. He had let himself get so distracted by whims of the future that he'd been blind to the present. Well, it was a good reminder to remain alert at the very least, though he hoped she wasn't about to break something again. Last time, Cullen had to pay for a few broken glass flagons that had fallen out of customers' hands, as well as those off the shelf she had slammed into, which had been both embarrassing and costly. Snuffler's sensitive nose must have picked up the familiar scent of wheelbarrows full of the apple mush left over from cider preparation from all the way out in the street. Due to the quantity of the stuff, Mrs. Cheryl Hina was always rather generous with giving a good amount of it to the mountain boar. Perhaps a bit too generous, Cullen thought, wincing at how fast a large mountain boar dashed through the open door, nearly bowling over Yeeg. "Yow!" The older farmer just barely managed to get out of the way, and Snuffler tumbled to a halt, seemingly remembering the trouble she had caused at the last second. As Cullen entered through the doorway, slowing his speed with far more grace than his pet, he was met with a chorus of laughter and cheers. Mrs. Hina was less enthusiastic, giving Snuffler a watchful glare, but clearly relieved at the lack of shattered glass. Cullen gave her a reassuring smile and hauled Snuffler up to her feet. "Close one, huh? Let's be more careful next time, all right, girl?"
"They're here. I thought I'd heard that hideous scream before."
"Welcome back, Cullen. Snuffler." Looks like she finally learned to slow down. How long did it take to teach her that?" Cullen waved with a practiced debonair disposition to the single table in the back, where a group of familiar faces were making more of a ruckus at his entrance than anyone else. The four men, including Yeeg, who had recovered from Snuffler's charge and was returning from his watch post by the door, were what Cullen might consider friends. At least, they were willing to talk about the local events and the Genranites with him every month in exchange for rounds, and that was all Cullen needed. As he motioned a somewhat dizzy Snuffler to follow him, he noticed that the brewery was oddly vacant, with only about 5 tables filled throughout the wide space. Mrs. Hina was the only one of the owners present, and she was polishing flagons rather than filling them. "Hey, fellas, good to see you too. How come it's so quiet in here, present company excluded, of course?" The oldest at the table, a stocky yet droop-faced miner named Michael, snorted in amusement.
"Anyone who blows their bonus here did so last week. You've just returned later than usual."
"Well, that, and everyone is working on the preparations for the celebrational feast," Ivy Frennet said cheerfully. He was a scrawny kid who was 2 summers younger than Cullen, but the difference in their frames would imply it was more like 4. Why, I'd probably be helping out too if you hadn't shown up. Your returns are always worth a celebration of their own. My returns are the free rounds that come with me. Cullen tousled Ivy's hair as the ensuing laughter caused the kid to blush. Come on, Cullen. You know we care about both you and the drinks. Leshen, though last at the table, and one of the 2 scribes at the village hall, raised his elegant glass flagon. Don't let my son's earnestness be mistaken for misplaced manipulation. Cullen sat down at the open seat they had prepared for him, nodding his appreciation. Though they were all kind enough, Leshen and Ivy were exactly the sort of people who were most susceptible to the influence of the Genronites, and Leshen even had a mustache in the same ugly style of the Citadel dwellers, though the blonde hair common among Carfelians somehow made it more repulsive on him than the ones he was imitating. Michael and Yeeg were far less enthralled, but that might have changed recently with the distraction of the feast. This would be a good time to carefully gather information about just how alone he would be in his resistance. But first, to order the drinks. They'd chosen this table due to its close proximity to the barrels, so orders could be made without needing to stand up. However, as soon as Cullen turned to face the bar, his heart sank for the 2nd time that day. A young woman, who he recognized as Tharina Hina, was speaking to her mother, taking her place at the bar. She smirked at Cullen with a gap-toothed grin that perfectly masked her snide, annoyingly perceptive nature. He needed to ensure she wouldn't mess up his reconnaissance. He waved apologetically to the others at the table. Sorry, fellas, please excuse me for a minute. As he walked over to the bar, he heard their amusement at his apparent infatuation bubble up behind him. It was for the best they thought as such. Since she was quite popular with the young men of the village, it would make Cullen seem a bit more unassuming to them. However, another part of him resented that anyone would think he cared for this inquisitive nuisance. All the more so, since she alone seemed to have seen past the affable act he presented in town. Tell me, Tharina, why have you decided to suddenly make your appearance? How could I not, after I heard your bore from all the way in the brewery? I hope you aren't going to have her run amok again. She raised an eyebrow at Snuffler, who was making herself as small as she could under the table. Don't worry. There's no danger of that. Promise. He leaned against the bar and began to speak in a low voice, letting his false tone fall away. I know why you really showed up. What are you looking to gain from knowing the reality of what I'm doing, It's become more important to me than ever before to know what people actually think of the Genronites, and I don't want you messing with that just because you were in the right place at the right time. Her smirk remained, but her eyes now focused on his with a fiendish delight. Please, I knew about it before I saw you secretly splitting your drink with Snuffler last month. And I'm not looking to blackmail or sabotage you, really. I just like watching it all play out. You're using such odd strategies just to have normal conversations about the Genronites that it becomes quite the spectacle. Cullen narrowed his eyes. Well, I'm glad I can provide such fantastic entertainment for you. I don't suppose you're trying to figure out what my final aim is? Tharina laughed. No, I don't care much about what you're doing with this elaborate charade, though why you think it's necessary has me stumped. I'd think you were secretly a spy for the Genronites if you didn't hate them so much. And how should I know that you aren't a spy, waiting for me to say something so they can have reason to retaliate? If I was, then ratting you out would ruin the show. Don't worry, I won't mess up your little plot here, whatever it is. So long as that's settled. He still didn't trust her completely, but at least he was fairly certain she wasn't being paid by the Genronites for nefarious purposes, whatever relief that gave. Cullen stood up and placed 10 Cerny at the bar. I'll take 4 quarts and a pint of that stock-spiced cider, Miss Observer. Right away, Mr. Schemer. He glared one last time before putting on his friendly demeanor once more and turning back towards the table. Well, don't keep us in suspense. Did you get a date? Yeeg asked. Cullen shook his head. Nope, guess I'm just unlucky today. On the bright side, the specialty cider will be here soon, and it sounds like it's especially good this season. The drinks arrived, and the topic mercifully turned away from Cullen's non-existent romantic concerns. As usual, the first few sips would cover familial updates and general chatter. The Frennets had a new child who would be named at the celebrational feast. Yeeg had mastered a few new songs on the pipe, and Michael had discovered a new vein of iron in the northern mines. All very pleasant things, and all of which Cullen was happy to hear, though the goal of this endeavor never left his mind. As the cider began to vanish, he poured part of his quart into a small glass. one he pretended to drink from while secretly sneaking at his snuffler under the table. He just needed to wait for the drinks to reach the halfway mark, then introduce a Generonite-focused topic so he could analyze the discussion with a clear mind. This time, however, he didn't even need the last step. Yeeg pointed at Michael.
Say, have you had any more problems with the lake wolves near the river road? I remember you mentioned they'd been getting bold.
Cullen narrowed his eyes. Lake wolves were certainly a force to be wary of. They mostly lived in the depths of the lake, but they would occasionally swim up the rivers before hibernation to grab a final meal before they were locked under the ice for the winter. They probably wouldn't travel up the small stream near his father's house, but Cullen would double-check the defenses just to be sure when he got home. The old miner grinned and shook his head.
They aren't a problem anymore. One of the men sent a report to the Citadel, and a whole bunch of the Generonite soldiers headed over, all dressed in that silly, colorful stuff.
He took another swig of the cider and continued.
They brought a bunch of baited cages with some sort of mechanism that closes the door without anyone needing to be there, and then they came back the next day to carry away the trapped beasts. I haven't seen a tooth or fin of them since.
That's certainly a good thing to hear, but what do you think they do with those beasts? Cullen made sure his hypothesis would be unsurprising and neutral, just so he could see where the rest of them stood on the matter. I bet they bring them somewhere deep into the Twisted Forest, so they can just let them go without caring too much if they eventually become a problem again. That way, they can keep getting our support by solving that same problem over and over. Well, that's a bit mean-spirited for a wild guess, Leshin interjected. The Generonites often go out of the Citadel for little visits and picnics near the Eastern Plains. They even go to the forests nearby with their children, and I don't think they do that without making sure that their danger removal service is working properly. I think it's rather glorious the way they work so hard to keep us safe. Such blind enthusiasm was expected from a scribe in the Great Hall, but it was still disheartening. Yeeg stroked his chin and thought.
I always just thought they ate those things. We provide quite a bit of food with the quota, but there's no way it's their only food source. There are several dozens of Generonites living in that tower, and I'm sure that scaled beasts are something they ate in the land they came from, just by looking at their clothes. I don't care what they do, so long as the end result is that we don't have any painful encounters with beasts.
Michael took another sip and leaned back.
Simple as.
All of them are rather banal and even supportive. At least they were compared to his father, who claimed they were performing experiments on the captured animals to make wretched machines of war for the inevitable reveal of their tyranny. While Cullen found that idea a bit silly, he was sure they were doing something with them to improve their control over the valley. Leshin spoke up, the cider doing its job. It's not just the protection. Imagine if the Generonites hadn't been here when Traveler's Pass got swamped in that landslide 30 years ago. We wouldn't ever have had the chance to use any of the old merchant wares from beyond the mountains, but now they're made right here in the valley. That was a bit much. Even though Cullen had visited the landslide, and it had seemed fairly natural, he thought it was almost too perfectly destructive. Such claims couldn't be assumed by either side. He responded carefully. Although, and hear me out with this, what if they were the ones who caused the landslide in the first place, just so they could sell those things at a way higher price? Michael shook his head.
No, I remember how expensive that stuff was. You could buy a dozen stew pots now for what you needed to buy a single one back when I was a young'un like you. Why would they cut off any potential competition, then make everything cheaper, and with higher quality wares to boot?
Yeah, that was a fair point. Any actual rebuttal to that would fall too far into his father's claims of hidden, slow-acting poisons coating the materials to weaken the valley, so Cullen just nodded, thinking of another angle. Leshin pulled at his imitative mustache. What if the Generonites were snakes given the appearance of humans, and sent to help us as an act of goodwill by the mountain spirits? That would explain their green scales and their lovely generosity, wouldn't it? Spirits. Being in the mountains for 10 years and never seeing one had dulled Cullen's belief in such beings. They probably existed in some capacity, but so many of the stories he'd heard of them were simply fools' ways of explaining natural phenomena Cullen had observed and successfully tested himself, that he had a hard time imagining it to be the case. The idea that the Generonites were transformed servants of these ethereal beings was so absurd that there wasn't need to comment on this theory and give it any credence, so Cullen continued to simply smile and listen. No, their mustaches are way too long for those of snakes. Ivy looked deep in thought. I think they're frogs. A round of laughter burst out from around the table.
What? What kind of frog has a mustache like that, kid?
Geeg chuckled. Ivy's face lit up, red as an apple. I've seen a few, I swear. Wait, maybe I was thinking of fish. Michael wiped his eyes, then pointed at Cullen.
He's the one who's got a snake's face hair. I've never seen a man so clean-shaven. Betcha Thorina would have accepted that date if you'd looked like old Arthie did. Your pa had a full wheat field of a beard by your age, so why don't you, huh?
Cullen let the bantering wash over him. He knew that these little dances could be used to his advantage, though he found it humorous that these old men had the odd notion that girls thought facial hair was attractive. He shook his head with a smile and shrugged. Well, that wheat field's only gotten bigger, so maybe the old spirit sower just misplaced my share. Another round of laughter sounded, this time in appreciation of wit rather than the mocking Ivy had suffered once more. Cullen leaned back in satisfaction, now to redirect the conversation back to a more serious discussion about the Genronites. But before Cullen could say anything again, Ivy slapped the table with excitement, his embarrassment forgotten. Hey, while we're on the topic of what the Genronites do, let's ask Thorina. I heard that Hina's brewery wouldn't exist now without one of their inventions. Cullen barely had time to object to having yet another voice against him, especially hers, before she had already pulled up a chair. Simpering snowstorm, she'd just been waiting for a chance to join in. So that's what the rumor is. That's a little insulting. Let me rephrase that for you. We wouldn't exist the way we do now without one of the Genronites' materials, not inventions. The machinery here is wholeheartedly Hina. Oh, so you don't rely on them at all, then? Ivy asked. No, not unless we need to buy a few new flagons due to porcine-related incidents. She winked towards Snuffler, and most of the table chuckled. The Genronites simply seem pretty reserved more than anything. Honestly, just between me and you guys, I don't even think they're very clever. Really now? Cullen asked. What was her aim with this? Was she trying to make him think she was on his side, or did she actually believe that? Years ago, they sold us one of the most versatile materials that this valley's ever seen as an oversized pillow. It looked like some sort of massive animal bladder, and it wasn't even that comfortable. I bet they have a bunch of stuff with huge potential, but they have no clue how to turn them into something useful. Whatever strange machines they have, they probably just bought them like that from someplace else. Thorina grinned. If I were to get my hands on some of the secrets in that fortress, just give me 5 days and my ideas could improve everything. Cullen nodded slowly. That sounded pretty authentic, but overall just a neutral statement at best and extreme underestimation of the Genronites at worst. Ooh, what did you make with that pillow? Ivy asked. Thorina laughed. It was actually my parents who made something with it. I couldn't have been more than a couple years old at the time. They're where I got my genius from, but I can't say any more. Trade secret and all that. A call for a drink came from one of the other tables, and she stood up. I've got to go, but remember that these drinks are made from raw Carfelian ingenuity. The Hina family doesn't settle for second rate. As she left, Cullen couldn't help but feel relieved that she hadn't bolstered the table's opinion of the Genronites. However, the topic at the table had now shifted to wondering what the invention was she'd alluded to, and how it used a pillow to work. At least he'd gotten a lot of good information on the Genronites' popularity tonight, and though it seemed like the feast hadn't really converted many to their side, the conversation didn't give him a lot of hope for the future either. All that was left was to purchase a barrel of the special brew, the one his father enjoyed the most, and say his goodbyes. Half an hour passed, and both the Frennets and Michael returned home after thanking Cullen for his generosity. Cullen waved them off with a smile. Thankfully, Thorina had also left, replaced by her far less annoying father, so he placed the order for a barrel of spiced cider and went outside to enjoy the evening air. There was a nice spot near the back of the brewery where a breeze from the western hills reached out even to this part of the village. These man-made streets tended to get a bit too warm in the daytime, but there was something peacefully comforting about the nighttime hours. As the barrel was rolled out on a wheelbarrow by one of the Hina sons, Yeek called out to Cullen.
Hey, kid! You want to borrow one of my carts? You can pick up more supplies before heading back, and carrying that barrel to your place would be much easier.
Cullen nodded with genuine appreciation. Thanks, Yeek. I'll be sure to return the cart when I can.
No, don't worry. The harvest is nearly over, and I'll be able to visit old Arthie from time to time again. Make sure he's fine while you're out in the mountains. I'll just pick up the cart then. He still trusts me enough, right?
I'm sure he does. I know my father has some outlandish ideas, but so long as you don't start shouting about the glorious Lord Cernir like Mr. Frennet, You'll always have a place at the house.
Thank you kindly, Cullen. Hey, have a safe travel back, you hear?
Likewise, my friend. Snuffler cheerfully trotted around the cart as Cullen finished loading it, not a single stumble in her step. She could hold her alcohol better than most men Cullen knew, and he bet she appreciated the taste to a finer degree, too. All right, girl. In exchange for that treat, why don't you help me pull this thing? Come on, let's get some supplies and head home. She climbed into the harness eagerly, and together they began the final journey of the day. The sky had dimmed, and the first appearances of stars began to manifest among the faint clouds as Cullen caught sight of his father's hut and the wooden walls on either side of it, all nestled in the familiar mouth of a cave in a secretive valley only an hour's walk from the edge of the village. It was small in size, especially when compared to the multiple floored buildings around the village square, but there was nowhere in the valley as comfortably protected from the cold of winter or the eyes and fangs of unwanted guests, nor any place filled with such warm nostalgia. It had been over 2 weeks since Cullen had left on the foraging expedition, and it would be good to see his father again. Especially after the careful conversation at the brewery, listening to wild spiels about the monsters and heroes and spirits beyond the mountains for hours at a time sounded wonderful, even if he had heard most of them before. However, Cullen was pretty sure they wouldn't be talking about such fanciful things tonight. He pushed the cart to a stop by the wooden wall where the nearly invisible gateway stood. This wall was all but impenetrable to any hungry outsider, and Cullen tapped it with pride. His father's guidance had been essential, but it was still an impressive display of craftsmanship nonetheless. Even so, if the Genernites were ever to find it... Cullen shuddered. Though the slight raise in quota requirements and the first real steps of the Genernites to obtain complete control over the people of the valley were still small in appearance, Cullen knew they would eventually grow to become far worse, and the village wouldn't be much help with their current perspective. If the Genernites continued to tighten their grip at this rate, it would still take years before things got really bad, but Cullen wasn't going to just wait around for that to happen. Today would be the first council of sorts, one consisting of a verbose old man, a loyal mountain boar, and a single charming forager, all united against the slow enthrallment to the Genernites. But for the time being, Cullen would make use of their enemies' bribes. He had expertly haggled as much dried food and fresh supplies as the cart from Yi could hold, and he still had a small amount of serenity left over. He would pick up any usable tools and minor luxuries that his father requested later this week, though not as many as last time. How much of the previous month's haul had lasted while Cullen had been in the mountains? Go ahead and greet father. I'll check on the storage, see if it's all been snarfed down. Snuffler grunted, perking up at the mention of the one who gave her favorite scratches. Out of everyone, even considering Cullen, no one could make her more at peace than that man with his brush. As she trotted off towards the front door, Cullen glanced up at the wall next to the house, preparing himself. He jumped, grabbing the top of the large wooden fence with practiced ease, and pulled himself over the top. He balanced for a moment, checking for any obvious issues within the enclosed cavern from 8 feet in the air. Any toppled shelves? Was there a break in the one-way gate, or a rotting stench? Nope. Cullen dropped down on the other side with a smile, pleased that his work was still properly in place. The cave didn't go that far back, only about 40 feet or so. It dipped down on one side, and a small hot spring in the corner made the whole cave and the house at its mouth comfortably warm. By the spring was a small stream that flowed under the wall of the cave, which Cullen had partially hollowed out to make a self-cleaning outhouse. Along the opposite side of the cave were several shelves, handmade by Cullen's mother more than 2 decades ago. The lower shelves were lined with somewhat organized groups of foodstuffs, each holding special preserves of fruit, various spices, and rows of dried meat. Cullen could place a time and journey to almost every one of the objects on the shelves, and was pleased to see that only the expected amount of jars and meats were missing. No creatures had gotten in. An intermittent thudding could be heard from the other side of the house, followed by a hideous squeal that would scare most into thinking a spirit had come to claim them, but Cullen smiled at Snuffler's way of announcing their return. A smooth voice for one so old shouted once in surprise, then again immediately in gleeful welcome. "Is that you, Hookhead? Made it down from the mountains, then? Good to hear!" Even from this far away, his excitement was infectious, and Cullen felt better than he had since finding the stone gut last week. Perhaps performing the role of the friendly, inquisitive forager was more of a burden than he knew. Or maybe it was just good to hear his father again. Cullen moved the cart into the cave via the one-way gate in the wall before sealing it up again from the inside. Then he grabbed a sealed flagon of cider, a loaf of bread, and some meats, and quietly opened the back door of the house, the only natural way in or out of the cave. He saw his father sitting in the specially crafted rocking chair near a tiny hearth, scratching the pig, who was up on her hind legs, practically in his lap.
Yes, you're such a good girl, aren't you? Been keeping my boys safe then, huh?
His scented cane had been knocked to the floor by Snuffler, and Cullen picked it up, setting the flagon on the table. That's enough, Snuff. Come on, get off him. Cullen tapped her rump softly with it, and she got down, still looking pleased with the attention. His father jumped at his words.
Simpering snowstorm, lad! Why'd you have to crawl in the back way again? You almost gave me a fright.
Just making sure everything was secure and stocked in the cave. No liquels got in, so all's well. Good to see you too, Father. Cullen handed the cane to his father and helped him up and out of the chair. Were his legs shaking a bit more than Cullen remembered? His expeditions were long, and though he had painstakingly added to the house for the ease of his father's movement, he couldn't be there in an emergency. Any visitors from the village weren't frequent, as his father only allowed the location to be shared with those who wouldn't rat it out to the Genronites. Yeeg's offer to stop by every so often was becoming increasingly welcome. His father's legs stopped wobbling when he fully stood up and set the cane on the ground.
Yes, it's good to see you too. Were those Genrys any trouble this month?
Cullen smiled. I suppose you could say that. His father's eyes opened wide with the joy of justification, but Cullen spoke again before he could interrupt. But it will be more pleasant over the evening meal, so allow me to prepare something nice for it.
Make sure your hands are properly cleansed before that, since you've been touching that Genry money. They probably smeared the coins with something they cooked up in their secret garden laboratories to weaken our muscles over time.
Cullen chuckled as he acquiesced, running some saved stream water over his hands in the wash basin. I'm sure they'd like that, but it wouldn't make sense to be only hurting the ones who give them supplies.
Hey, I didn't say they were smart about what they're doing, but I've seen a bunch of story seekers from the village with pitiful physiques compared to yours over the past few years. Try not to directly touch it, just to be safe.
You got it, sir. His father nodded and leaned forward with a golden-gray eyebrow raised.
Well, is this Genry trouble at least enough to convince some of the others in the village of their trickery? They all still thought those outsiders were harmless, last I heard.
Cullen began to slice some of the meats he had purchased, laying them alongside some herbs in a metal pan over the tiny hearth. And they will still think they're harmless, at least for a while more. This step the Genronites have taken today is a test for plots to come. Snuffler sat down at her seat by the table, ready to catch any morsels that Cullen might drop for her.
They already did that years ago, when they first arrived.
Cullen's father began to pace back and forth, his cane smacking the ground in an almost rhythmic pattern, as he waved his other hand about with the muscle memory of a practiced storyteller. Cullen already knew this story, he had almost gotten the whole thing memorized at this point, but the sting of the sudden rise in the quota requirements had gotten him eager to hear it once more.
I was about your age, with flowing hair, abdominals you could break a rock on, and a knack for sniffing out a good tale from any merchant or traveler from beyond the mountains. The harvest festival was in full swing, and I had about 70 starry-eyed folks latched onto every word I was saying about the beast men of the western plains, who lopped off the heads of any royalty they met with such vicious vigor the crowned corpse ball would hang upon the stars for a week before falling back down to be buried. Just as the story was winding up to the climax, I was interrupted by a host of snake-cloaked visitors, more than had ever visited us at once. Only their leader spoke to us. The rest of them refused to use anything but their own mysterious language. I could see them grinning and giggling as they looked up at us, plotting against us in full daylight. They took over the old market square, setting up little tents wherever they pleased, and giving nothing in return but those ugly little clay rings they call surni. I swear they're such stupid little rings, but because the outsiders would give gaudy weapons with way too much clutter on them, and useless baubles good for nothing but staring at, just for handing the same surni back again, everyone in the village just ate it up. They all thought they were getting free stuff, but I could see that these outsiders had managed to trick their way into getting the center of the village all to themselves, and all they had to do was pawn off their junk. Of course, I told everyone just what was happening, right from the beginning, but practically no one listened. So I watched these Genrys, looking for their ultimate motive, and found that they resembled the trickster serpents of the Misty Bay, far to the north. I had heard tales of these leeches from not one, but 3 different merchants. Both Genrys and the serpents wore scales of green, both tended to smile too broadly, showing all their teeth, and both harbored wishes to become rulers of anyone they visited. Genries are serpents in disguise. Even if they could pretend to be human, they didn't fool me a bit. Before I was able to convince anyone else of this, they had planted giant seeds in the marketplace, and it grew into a pale nest for them to skulk in. They built upon this nest until it became that tower where they plot how to brainwash everyone in the valley.
Cullen took the metal pan off the fire and began serving it out onto a couple plates by the table. This part of the story was probably more than a little embellished, but it was entertaining.
When I could see their manipulations start to take effect, making the villagers build in their fashion and wear clothing in their image, I knew I had to leave. Nothing I said convinced them. Even if some of those fools believed me, they liked the little gifts too much to do anything about it. I took everything and built a new life here, away from the direct influence of the Genries.
With that, his father began to sit down, and Cullen helped him reach his pillow on the floor safely.
So, as you can clearly tell, they've been slowly making moves for a long time.
Well, what I've got to report isn't as dramatic as what you've just said, but at least it's more than they've done in my lifetime. Cullen set the plates on the table, used his knife to open the flagon seal, and poured the spiced cider into 2 cups. They're throwing a celebrational feast, almost like a puffed-up harvest festival. He broke off a chunk of fresh bread with a flourish for dramatic effect, setting it by his plate.
Ah, and you've caught wind of a dastardly plot to poison the food.
Cullen poured the rest of the cordial he had gotten from old Galila into a basin for Snuffler on the ground, who happily began slurping it up.
Nah, it's something far sneakier.
To supposedly pay for it, they raised the quotas we have to give them by 15%, far more than is needed for even the most extravagant of parties, and so we need to work that much harder for the same bonus of certainty. I gave them some of the best stone gut in the valley, and they returned the favor by paying less than usual.
So that's the snake's plot. Those lily-livered parasites. And you said everyone cared nothing for this hidden treachery.
Cullen snorted, a wry grin crossing his face. Why should they? Even if they knew of it, the village would probably be happy to forge chains for themselves if it got them more cerny from the Genries.
That may as well be exactly what they're doing.
Cullen's father drank deep of his cider and slammed the empty cup upon the table.
We'd better do something about this. Take it into our hands entirely if need be.
Cullen nodded. My thoughts exactly. Well, do you have any ideas? We can't attract too much attention, or we'll have Warlord Cernier catch wind of it.
If the truth of the Genries' plan is too sneaky to earn the valley's ire, we can create a lie that they're about to mix some sort of poison into future feasts. Some dark concoction that will make them want to worship the snakes.
Cullen wiped up the last of the sauce with the bread. Nah, if we don't have some sort of manufactured proof, they won't believe us. And I don't think I can create a good enough hallucinogenic for that. He thought as he chewed the final, most satisfying bite of the meal.
Maybe I could disguise myself as a monstrous spirit, scale the fortress tower, and scare that Cernier into leaving us alone? Ha! They just think you're an old friend of theirs.
His father poured himself a second helping of cider, bigger than the first.
Though if that works, it would be pretty funny to see them all run around helplessly in their little nest.
As the cider began to vanish even faster, a determined tone entered his voice.
Or you could use that knife of yours and just kill that bastard where he sleeps.
Cullen started. Whoa, hang on, I don't want to kill them. How much cider have you had already, father? The older man blinked.
Right. Sorry, I got a bit carried away there. That being said, it's not out of the question, is it? Who knows what they might already be doing to us without our knowledge?
Cullen cleared the plates and cups from the table, setting them in a basin with some excellent cleansing calendula he'd found earlier. Don't get me wrong, I definitely don't want them ruling over us either, but they haven't yet done anything deserving of death. Besides, I've got to admit they make pretty neat things sometimes, and I do appreciate them dealing with predators occasionally. All we need is to scare them out of their attempts at tyranny, make them realize we won't be bullied or manipulated.
Bah, I think you've just been listening to the fools at the bar too much.
He leaned back, resting against the pillow. Snuffler laid down next to him, rolling over for belly scritches.
Say, have I ever told you the full story of the beastmen of the Western Plains? The ones who were known as the Bane of Royalty? I've mentioned them in other tales before, but perhaps they may just be our key to bringing back the balance of power in the valley.
Cullen was pretty sure he had heard this story at some point, but he didn't remember it well. Although, if their title was anything to go by, and if they actually existed at all, then they would probably be quite useful in this predicament. He began cleansing the dinnerware. Go on then, this should be good. His father cleared his throat.
A long time ago, far beyond the western mountains, past many lands incomprehensible to us in climate and in culture, there lived a tribe of ferocious beast men. Each was twice the size of a normal man and as strong as 10. For centuries, they kept themselves resigned to a far corner of the world, keeping their raw strength contained. One day, something changed, and the beast men began to move. Despite their monstrous nature, they were not aimless in their wanderings. They moved continuously eastward, searching for those who put themselves above others. Why they did this, no one knew for sure. Whenever they encountered a king or some kind of leader of any kind on their journey, they would work themselves into a frenzy of fury, using all their unnatural strength to slaughter their lordly target. The only royal survivors of this monstrous force were the ones who renounced their leadership and became like any other person. Only then would the beastmen take their leave, continuing their seemingly eternal wandering.
Cullen finished cleansing the final dish and set it upon the small mantel. If I were to guess, a lord of some sort went too far and did something terrible to these beastmen in their far-off land. Why else would they harbor such a desire for vengeance? His father chuckled.
Exactly my thoughts. Such a force would be quite a good bargaining chip on our side, even just as a specter in the mist. The last time I spoke to anyone who had seen them was 30 years ago, when Traveler's Pass was destroyed. Chances are those beastmen are still about, and if they're even half as powerful as the stories say, they're desperately searching for more unjust rulers to put down after clearing every one of them from the distant land. And I don't think there's anyone better than you when it comes to exploring the wilds. If you can go on a quick journey beyond the mountains and have even a few of them join us, I think you might just be the only one who could save our valley.
Well, that was a long shot if ever Cullen heard of one. A fabled group of warriors, whose ideals kinda sorta lined up with what his father wants, lost in a faraway land 30 years ago, and on top of all of that... Cullen shook his head. That journey would be anything but short. I've never gone beyond the ruins of the pass, and if I were gone for a few months, how would I make sure you're safe? Not to mention that Warlord Cernier would notice if I go missing, considering how much he seems to love the stone cut I bring. What if he investigates my disappearance and finds our home? His father hummed in thought.
We'll break those barriers when we reach them. The three of us are quite intelligent, you know. We can find some way eventually.
He stood up, Cullen helping him again.
Thank you for all your help, son. Why don't you go ahead and get some sleep? I can take care of myself for now.
You got it. Good night, Father.
Good night, Cullen. May the Night Watcher be your friend, and keep you in her umbra for all slumbers you have.
The blessing was an old one, and Cullen found it about as useful as one of Therena's interjections, but he appreciated his father's care nonetheless. Tomorrow, he'd collect some more common items from the hills near the house and trade them with some of the villagers. Maybe he'd even pick up one of those colored flagons if it was on sale, and of course, he'd pick up some of the apple mush for Snuffler as well. Then, preparations would begin for another trek up the mountains. It'd been a long and eventful day, and Cullen was finally feeling the exhaustion catch up with him. As he prepared for sleep in the quiet of the house, it felt as if an uncomfortable burden was weighing down on his stomach. Was this notion he felt worming its way through his gut that of frustrated loneliness? Cullen had scoffed at the idea whenever it had manifested in the past, but with these 3 interactions with the Genronites, the ones who called themselves his friends, and his father, Cullen realized his perspective on the valley was one that he shared with only himself. The Genronites were growing in greed and desire, yet they didn't need to be removed. If someone were to make them understand respect, and to return to how they had been years ago, that would be perfect. It was even possible that Cullen himself might be the one to act as the guardian of the valley, and by using some sort of plot bring about this kind of world. But if he was gone for too long, the Genronites would most likely fall back to their corrupt ways. To act as a guardian would mean to give up his desire to explore the upper mountains of the valley, and the beautiful lands of the world beyond. Each of these paths seemed to be impossible to attain as they were. How could he ever hope to walk both at once? He let a silent sigh pass through his teeth, and Snuffler prodded him with her snout, giving a worried grunt. It's all right, Snuff. There's still plenty of time for something to change. We won't be trapped in this miserable crevice of a problem for long. We've helped each other out of some nasty scrapes in the mountains before. We can handle one that's all in my mind. She seemed to brighten at that, and lay down on her small bed, calm and content. Even if what he said had been mostly to reassure her, he found that he was quite persuasive to himself as well. He lay down, knowing that he'd soon think of the next step to take. After all, he was one of the most skilled people he knew. As sleep finally fell upon him, he just prayed that the path ahead he was searching for would become clear soon, lest this frantic grasping in the fog caused him to stumble off a cliff.